Hi, I'm Kevin Lee. I'm the CEO of the eMarketing Association. I also run Did It and Giving Forward. Frida Polli is joining me. She's the founder of pymetrics, which is an AI-based tool for recruiting. So, Frida, can you tell us sort of what was the catalyst for you deciding you wanted to put AI to an unusual use?
Sure, absolutely. So my background is I spent 10 years as an academic scientist at Harvard and MIT. And I studied people. That's what I did. And then I loved the research that I was doing, but I wanted to find a more applied use case for a lot of the really cool technology we had been developing. So I went to business school to kind of figure out my next path in life. And it was at the business school at Harvard that I saw recruiting firsthand for 2 years because that's what MBA students do. They try to figure out their next gig. And I was just really that's where the proverbial light bulb went off. I was just really struck by the fact that, recruiting hadn't changed, in the 10 plus years that I had, tried recruiting out of college. And I just thought that was a real loss. And so what we do with Pymetrics, we don't just apply artificial intelligence to the world of talent. We also apply an entirely new form of behavioral science. So I think that's actually probably the more critical component of what Pymetrics does is that we measure people differently, and then we also apply AI to the problem. But fundamentally, what we are is a soft skill platform. So instead of saying, hey, Kevin, give me your resume and I'll give you a read on what your hard skills are, what your experience is, we look at what your potential for future roles might be, including roles you may have never even considered, right? So the beauty of soft skills is that they're future facing, forward facing, as opposed to being backward facing. And they speak far more to your potential than your past or your pedigree, which I think is so critical now. So we capture all of these all the soft skill data using behavioral exercises. That was my background, my scientific background. And then we take that and we combine it with machine learning or AI to really not only take someone's soft skills, but then optimize the fit between an individual and a role. And the reason I chose to do that, like I said, is because I think I saw how antiquated the process still was, and also how many times it failed. I mean, I think that Harvard students are some of the most overserved people in the world, which they have. That's just a thing. And even there, the failure rate was so high, right? People would decide, oh, I want to be I want to get this type of internship, and then all their friends would be like, well, I'm not sure you're a great fit, but they would be gunning for it. They're smart, they sort of get their way through the interview, and then 2 days into their internship they'd be like, I hate my job. And I just saw that over and over, and I was like, there's got to be a better way. It's just back to like what Netflix did for movies, right? Like I think we're old enough to remember the experience with Blockbuster, where you would go in, you'd spend an hour picking 2 movies based on, their resume, right? The blurb. Then you'd go home and you'd be like, I hate this movie, right? And we're still doing that in the analog world of recruiting. And I just think that, Pymetrics is the Netflix that will show us a better way. So.
Right. So apparently there's failure on both sides, right? There's
Oh yeah,
failure on the
100%.
candidate side and there's failure at the HR
Yeah.
department side.
Yeah. I mean, it's not an either side thing. It's that both sides lack good information as to whether there's a fit. That's really at the end of the day what it is. It's not like Blockbuster was like a bad actor. They weren't trying to have you rent movies you didn't like. They just didn't have the data and the algorithms to ensure that fit was done accurately. And so it's the same thing here. The people are the movies and the companies are the renters. And the problem is just that the movie doesn't know whether the person's going to like it, and the person doesn't know if the movie is the right fit for them. So it's really about getting better data in the form of soft skill data. So that's part of what I saw at HBS was that they'd look at somebody's resume. Okay, yes, you've done this job before. Maybe thought that you'd done something sort of adjacent, so you'd probably be a good fit. But really what these recruiters were trying to understand was soft skills. They were trying to infer from your hard skills what kind of soft skills you might have. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, I want someone who's a team player. Okay, well, now I'm going to read the resume to try to figure out whether you have something that hints at the fact that you're a team player, right? Whereas what we do is we actually measure whether you're a team player, right? It's just a lot easier. And again, not all jobs require you being a team player. There are a lot of roles that are individual contributor roles, so it's not important. So what we saw was a failure of information. The information that people were using to make that decision was not nearly comprehensive and holistic enough to make that fit accurate, which is exactly the problem with Blockbuster, right? What Netflix has done is not that the movies are any different or the people, they're the same. It's just that they have captured a much broader set of data on a movie and on your preferences and made that fit much more accurate.
I imagine you're primarily selling to HR departments, in particular the recruiting side of HR departments. And I'd venture a guess that they feel like that they're really good at the interview process and that they're really great at picking out those candidates and identifying the
No,
soft skills. So given that,
no, I don't think so.
in particular, and they also probably say that they're not subject to gender bias
Right.
or any other biases that they're really trying to eliminate. So how do you enlighten them on the fact that they do in fact have all these biases, both from being perhaps bad at identifying soft skills, but also that they have, race or gender or other biases, which they're overtly trying to eliminate? Like they actually have a memo that says we're trying to be
Right.
more balanced, right? But yet, if you look at their hiring practices,
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily hold true.
Yeah. Well, I actually give talent professionals a lot more credit, actually, Kevin. I think that a lot of them, hiring is hard. I mean, we struggle, right? I mean, hiring is hard, and I think that they are aware of how hard hiring is. So I don't actually think people are like, "Oh, I'm perfect at it. I'm so good at it." I think they are looking for things that can help with their decision making. So I actually think it's not a challenging sale from that perspective. And I also think that people at this point are pretty aware of their biases. I think, unfortunately, they have been led astray. And what I mean by that, again, not intentionally, but I think, 10, 15 years ago, sort of a whole cottage industry developed around unconscious bias training, right? So the solution to the biases of the human mind was unconscious bias training. And we have, lots and lots of, folks that are still in the market selling that type of training as the panacea or the cure all, right? And unfortunately, we now have 10, 15 years of data showing that it's actually completely ineffective. In fact, it can sometimes make things worse because now, before I used to think I had biases, so I might be more careful. Now I'm like, oh, I've been cured. And so, it's like, so I actually think that I give people a lot more credit. I think we've been operating in an environment of lack of knowledge and lack of tools. And I think that that's the way HR approaches these things, is realizing that they need more tools and everything else. And then I think we educate the market while we sell to these companies. And part of the sale process is, showing proof points from, previous engagements that have been successful. So.
Right.
So
One
I
of the
actually
things we
give them a
spend a
lot more
lot of,
credit than I actually do give, HR professionals a lot of credit because it's hard. I mean, it's a hard problem to solve. It's not the same as, picking I don't know, tomato at the grocery store. So
well, the downside risk to picking a bad tomato is pretty low.
exactly.
So one of the things we think about a lot in marketing and doing marketing audits, whether it's paid media audits or earned media audits, et cetera, is opportunity cost, right? The cost of making a bad decision or
Yep.
making no decision at all. So where's the greatest risk for an organization? Is it in making the wrong hire, or is it in promoting the person to a role for which they're not a fit?
That's a tough question to ask. I think honestly, if I may be so bold, I think the biggest risk is really homogenizing your workforce and doubling down on more of the same. I actually think that's the biggest risk, because what organizations have done is, and I'm going to be a science nerd for a second, they've really reduced their chances of making a type 1 error, which means if I hire someone, I want to make sure that they will be successful at the cost of making more type 2 errors, which means that if I don't hire someone, I'm confident that they're not a fit. And so what they're doing is, because they want to reduce the likelihood that someone is not going to work out, they're actually saying no to a whole host of people that actually could be great fits, but we'll just never know. And I think that's actually the far bigger risk is, and that's how we end up homogenizing the workforce, right? Because people become very good at pattern recognition, but that pattern recognition is extremely limited in what I can recognize, right? So you must have gone to a certain school and you must have done an internship at and all these things. And then if you've done all these things, then I can feel fairly confident that you're going to work out here. But then you've narrowed your opportunity set to like 5% of the population, right? So actually the biggest opportunity cost is if we don't broaden the funnel, if we don't look for those patterns outside of what we already know, and if we really just give short shrift to a much broader demographic of people that could do it. And again, I mean, just a little plug on soft skills, that's what soft skills allow you to do, right? Is I can, determine the soft skill profile of, someone who is, Caucasian male and has been in the Western world most of their upbringing. And I can find that exact same pattern in a person of color, who lives in sub-Saharan Africa, right? I mean, that's the beauty of soft skills, is that they're very equally distributed amongst all genders, races, environments. And so I can, even if my pattern to date has been pretty limited, I can broadly expand that by looking at different types of data, which, by the way, you could never do with a resume, because, the resume of a person of color in sub-Saharan Africa looks nothing like that of a white male, raised in the US, for example, right? So that's why I think we have to expand our opportunity set of people that we're looking at. And to do that, we need to start looking at different types of data.
So one of the factors that ends up important in a lot of roles at organizations, particularly in the sales, marketing, and advertising arena, is, I guess you would just call it charisma.
Mhm.
And it's not necessarily purely attractiveness. It's sort of a bunch of personality traits that also
Mhm.
translate into charisma. So
Sure.
how effective are tools at measuring that
Sure.
when that becomes an important criteria for hiring? And
Yeah.
then how do you layer in the sort of behavioral types of charisma into the attractiveness? Because obviously if you're hiring a person who's going to be sort of the face of the organization, physical attractiveness may also be important. Of course, nobody wants to talk about that, right?
Sure.
But
Sure.
walk into an Abercrombie and you pretty much know that it's important, right? So
Sure.
how should HR departments use the tools at their disposal to find that balance of
Sure.
the sort of psychological charisma as well as the physical attractiveness?
Sure. Well, I can't really speak to the physical piece because that's not part of what we do. I can't.
I know.
So we'll put that, and that seems like a territory you'd want to tread very lightly on. So that I can't help anyone with, and I'll just say that straight out. The other type of charisma, I think, is, again, it's back to soft skills, right? There are components of somebody's personality, and, thinking style and socio-emotional style that would make somebody, in quotes, charismatic and somebody not. And by the way, charisma is important for, a small percentage of jobs, but, very unimportant for, let's say a large percentage of other jobs, right? So I think that that's where soft skills can be extremely helpful in that. So first of all, like, just take the way pymetrics works. First, we would determine, is charisma even important for your job? Because I think a lot of times, and the answer may be a resounding yes, right? But a lot of times people have these preconceived notions of, oh, for this job, I must be XYZ, right? So the first thing we do is we go in and we profile the organization. We say, actually, we found that your high performers look like this, right? So that's the first sort of sanity check, is what are the things that actually make someone successful? And then it's finding that soft skill profile, which may or may not include charisma, that then matches to that. Does that make sense? So absolutely, a soft skill tool can help with that. And I think, again, the more critical component is figuring out whether that's actually necessary or not. The other thing I will say about charisma is that I think it's also very situationally dependent, meaning, I mean, I think some people would say, hey, Frida Polli is pretty charismatic, which is wonderful, right? However, I can guarantee you there are lots of different environments where if I was, maybe pitching a different product, or if I was in a different industry or whatever, I would come across as completely non-charismatic because I wouldn't have the same passion and the same enthusiasm. So I think it's back to this idea that everybody has a fit, everybody has a role to play, and it's really trying to identify that sort of fingerprint, DNA, whatever you want to call it, that makes a person successful in a particular role, rather than coming up with these sort of blanket statements of like, I need X, Y, and Z, because I think those are less accurate. So I don't know. Did that answer your question, Kevin?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great.
You mentioned that profiling or doing the research within the companies to identify high performers was a sort of an important stage of you building your system to be able to create that fit. So it would seem that pretty much requires that the companies be of a certain size and that they also have a fairly well-structured set of roles for each title. right, in order for that to work. So
Yeah.
is there a size below which, you wouldn't be able to create a profile? It would make it more difficult to apply your platform, like certain company
Yeah, sure.
sizes?
So I can answer that question. So generally we do tend to work with larger companies, for a variety of different reasons. Also because we're not just doing talent acquisition, we're also doing talent management, mobility, reskilling. So as you can imagine, a Fortune 500 or Fortune 2000 is going to have more opportunity there, than a pymetrics, right? Where, we're 120 people and there's just less opportunity. However, that doesn't mean that a smaller organization cannot use us. I mean, we don't require that big a footprint, to really be functional. And we can also, so, when you talk about AI or data science, a lot of times you can start out with what someone would consider a generic algorithm, meaning, historically people who are in sales at a small company tend to have this profile, right? You can start out with that, which hasn't been customized necessarily to your workforce. And then as you get more data, you can customize it. So we really shouldn't view this as a blocker, like, oh, small companies can't use it. That's not at all the case. Again, we're a small organization. And so therefore we've sort of targeted larger orgs. But I wouldn't say that, that it's a tool that can only be used by large companies. So.
Great. So this is more of a self-serving question in that I sort of learned a hard lesson when I started giving forward the nonprofit about a year ago, which was I didn't treat volunteer recruitment in the same way that I treated employee recruiting, right? And so I would sort of say, well, they're free, therefore I should change my decision-making process around it. And I ended up with folks who ended up not really as well qualified to do the things that I wanted them to do. And I'd sort of failed to quantify the overhead that came from supervising people who were a bad fit, right? So
Right.
has this type of technology been deployed at all within the volunteerism category as well as within employment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that it's any different really, whether, again, you're talking about, is someone a good fit for the job that they're going to carry out? I don't think it matters whether the job is paid or not paid, right? I mean, I
Right.
think at the end of the day, somebody's fit to a role. I mean, obviously people have to get paid because they have to pay the bills, but at the end of the day, you choose a job because you have an affinity for it. So whether it's a paid or volunteer job. And I think for a volunteer job, it's even more important because you're not getting a check, right? So you want to make sure
Right.
that that fit is there. So yes, absolutely, this technology works in both situations for sure.
And for the smaller organizations that you're serving, do you anticipate or do you already have sort of a self-service offering where it would
Yep.
use the sort of
Yep.
boilerplate,
We do.
you could sort
Yes.
of self-identify the
Yeah. And I mean,
categories?
look, large organizations can do that as well. We always try to then say, hey, let's have you, sort of roll off of the generic form and onto a custom template. But that can happen over time. You know what I mean? We would always encourage that because, again, we think everyone's a special snowflake in their own right. But there's absolutely no harm to trying to make your process more objective and less biased by using a generic algorithm.
And how quickly have you typically gotten feedback from the companies that are using your platform saying, wow, it
Yeah.
really does make a material
Yeah,
difference?
absolutely. So, I mean, I would say that that's happened relatively quickly. So again, it depends on sort of the outcome that you're looking for. If the outcome you're looking for is, oh my goodness, these people perform so much better, that usually takes time. As you can imagine, they need to go through performance review cycles and so on and so forth, right? So that can actually take some time. But I think just even qualitative feedback from, wow, we've never, the quality of candidates is so much better. That happens often very automatically. And the other thing that's really cool about that is that often they will say something along the lines of like, wow, the quality of candidates is so great and they're so different, they're so diverse, like there's not this cookie cutter homogeneity that's at play. It's very much like we've expanded top of funnel. These people are definitely different than what we would have thought previously, but they're really high quality. And I mean, I could just think of one example or several examples actually in the retail space before COVID hit, where people were hiring store associates, whatever, and typically they would have only hired maybe potentially sort of millennials or younger folk. And all of a sudden they were getting people who were out of the sort of normal age bracket, like older, and they're like, these people are great, would never have attracted them or considered them before, not for because of some evil intent, but just because, our funnel wasn't attracting them, we weren't considering them in the same way, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's really inspiring to see that level of feedback happen very instantaneously. And again, then obviously we want to see that they're performing better and, blah, blah, blah. But the diversity and quality of candidate feedback is almost immediate. So that's great.
Right. And it would seem like you had spoken earlier about sort of that risk aversion that seems to happen where people are sort of scared to make a decision on a candidate who may not be
Totally.
a great fit,
That's
but it
right.
seems like this empowers the people to maybe make
Exactly right.
decisions.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think the way that to view this is it helps people who otherwise might not take a chance on someone to take a chance. You know what I mean? Because I think
Right.
when you're going outside of your comfort zone, you want some indication that, oh yes, this is a good decision, right? And that's just human. That's just human nature, right? I mean, we're
Right.
all kind of in our own way, like, creatures of habit, right? And so we're trying to empower people to broaden their aperture, take a risk on folks that they wouldn't have considered. And, oh, by the way, we're guaranteeing that you're going to get better performance, longer tenure with those folks. So trust us, and trust the data that we've already collected. This will work out, sort of better for everyone in the long term. The one thing I would add, is that if you're able to put this in is I think the one sort of, we spoke a lot about soft skills. I think the one thing I would say about the machine learning or AI backbone is we really need to make sure that it is indeed checked for bias, and if that bias exists, that it is mitigated or removed. Because I think there has been this sort of flocking to AI tools with the hope that they would be more objective than human beings, right? Because they don't have the unconscious bias. But unfortunately, AI tools are trained on the same data set that you would train that humans have collected, right? So if there's bias in that data, unfortunately, the algorithms can pick up on that. And so, we've developed a very careful, thought out way of removing it, of reducing it. But that is not the case with every single machine learning or AI platform. And I think I just want to make that very clear that, like, while we are, have lots of data to support, and we're in the process of making that data publicly available, this idea that we mitigate bias, we are bias free. There are others that make those claims without really having, with either no knowledge that that's actually the case, or, even worse, knowledge that that may not be the case, right? And either situation, that's just, it's basically bad marketing, back to marketing, right? It's false advertising. So just be careful of that. I think when buying these types of tools is that, there is a lot of sort of deceptive or false, or maybe deceptive or false is the wrong word, like a lot of hope that this stuff is less biased, but unless you've actually gone through and audited your platform, you really can't say with any certainty. So we would just encourage a proper vetting of platforms, and including, asking for audit results and things of that nature, which sounds super technical, but really vendors should be able to provide that for you. So.
Yeah, I maybe we had read the same article, but I think within the last week or two, there was an article in one of the major newspapers
about,
about the biases of AI if you feed them bad data.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. Yep. And again, it's just like human beings, right? Like if we get fed certain data, it tends to be biased, then we are going to end up making biased outcomes. The advantage to an AI system is that we've audited human decision-making for a long time. And unfortunately, that is extremely biased, right? And again, it's back to the unconscious bias training. We've looked to that to help. It doesn't really help. So we've audited human systems for a long time and found them to be terribly biased. We are now starting to apply that same rigor to AI systems. And the plus side is that, unlike a human brain where you cannot just go in and go like, let's take out the bias, like with an AI system, because you have control over it, complete control, you can actually go in and reduce whatever variables, weightings, et cetera, are causing that, and then audit it again, and ensure that it doesn't have bias. So that's the beauty of AI. It's not that it's looking at different data. It's not that it's not learning the same way. It's that you can actually essentially correct that bias in a way that's not possible with the human brain.